start the recording. Okay, so let's start with a quick introduction to Java programming. So what I pulled up here is the NetBeans software. This is the software that we're going to be using throughout the term to do all of our programming assignments in. And the first thing I want to give you today is a very short introduction to the basics of setting up your first program in Java, how to use the appropriate steps in NetBeans, and then we'll also be going through a slightly longer example to show you what appears in a typical Java program. So let's start, first of all, let's start the process of starting a Java program completely from scratch in NetBeans. The first step in doing that is we have to create what's called a project, and there's a couple of ways to do that. One way is you can go up to the File menu and choose the New Project option. Another more convenient shortcut is that there's a toolbar at the top, and there's a button in the toolbar that you can use for making a new project. So whichever of those two methods you choose, this is the method you'll be using to make a new project. All right, now the next thing to be aware of is that NetBeans is set up to allow you to do lots of different kinds of things, and in some places this will be a little bit overwhelming. The first place where this looks a little bit overwhelming is when you ask to create a new project. The first thing NetBeans will ask you is what kind of project you would like to create, and it's a little bit confusing because there's many options available. But throughout this entire term, there's only one of these options that we're going to be using. We're always going to be using the option that comes from this category, Java with Ant. And in that category, there's a specific project type, just a plain vanilla Java application. That's essentially the only type of project that we're going to be working with in this course. And you use the same procedure every time that you make a new project. So let's go ahead and go on to the next screen and start setting up our Java application. Right now, the next thing that this next screen will be asking you for are some key details about the project. The first of these is that every project has to have a name. And automatically, NetBeans will give you a suggestion for a project name, which isn't terribly meaningful. In most cases, the better thing to do is to replace that project name with a name that's more meaningful to you. So later on, when you go looking for that project, it will be easier to find. All right, and since this is going to be our first example project, this is essentially what's known as the Hello World project. The appropriate name for this project is simply Hello. All right, now, the next thing that you'll specify in this dialog is where the project is going to be located. Now, by default, what NetBeans likes to do is NetBeans likes to put all of its projects in a folder that it sets up precisely for that purpose. If you've installed NetBeans, what you may have noticed is that NetBeans sets up a NetBeans projects folder that's going to be located in your home directory. And by default, NetBeans wants to put all of the projects there. So if you'd like to keep using that as a place to put all of your projects, that's perfectly fine. If you have another location where you'd prefer to put it, you can instead click the Browse button. For today's example, I'm going to be putting everything on the desktop because that's also a place where it's relatively easy to find things that you've created. All right, and then the final thing to check is, and by default, this will automatically be checked on. The other thing you'll ask to do is to create what's called the main class. This is essentially the starting point for your program, and you want to make sure that this option is set on. This is the appropriate option to use for that purpose. All right, so we'll go ahead and click Finish. That then will create the project and get you set up and ready to work with the project. Okay, now here's some things that you're going to get when you create a project. First of all, on the left side of the screen, there's what's called the Projects view. This is where you're going to see a listing of all of the projects that you currently have open and available to you. And you can also use this view to navigate around and find various parts of projects that you need to locate later. In the early projects that we create, they're all going to have a very simple structure. The simple structure to these things is that there's really going to have one thing in them, and that's the Java source code file, which is the code for your program. And that's about the only interesting thing that will be in the project itself. All right, also you'll notice here when I created the project, NetBeans automatically opened a window for us so we can see what's in that hello.java file. And this is the place where you're going to be writing all of the code for your program. And this is where most of your work will be taking place. All right, so let's take a closer look at what's here. The first thing to notice is that when we set up the project, NetBeans has set up a few elements that are absolutely necessary. These are things that always need to be there anytime you create a program. And fortunately, NetBeans has created some of these things for us automatically. So let's take a quick look at what we've got here and talk about the structure of what goes on in a Java program. The first thing that's required in a Java program is you have to set up a construct called a class. The reason that we have this is that Java is what's known as an object-oriented language. And in object-oriented languages, programs basically consist of a collection of things called classes. All right, now, in later programs, as we get deeper into Computer Science 150, and especially as we get into Computer Science 250, you're going to be seeing programs that have many classes in them. But at least for the first few weeks of this course, every example we look at will consist of just a single class. And for that, you'll just use the class that NetBeans sets up for you automatically, and you won't need to do anything more to get that set up and working correctly. The only thing to make note of at this point is that part of what makes the structure of a class are these curly braces. Curly braces are a thing that the Java language uses very extensively, and one of the more important reasons for having curly braces in Java is that curly braces basically produce structure. And here we see an example of some structure, and one bit of structure that you see here is that if some entity in Java contains other stuff inside of it, it'll use a system of curly braces to show that relationship and that containment. All right, so what's going on here is we have an entity called a class, and inside the class there are other things, and that's simply reflected through the use of these curly braces. All right, so the left curly brace that shows up here basically marks the beginning of the contents of the class. And then the matching right curly brace that shows up here, that marks the end of the contents of that particular thing. Right now, in our early examples, of all the early examples of classes that we're going to look at, there's going to be exactly one thing inside each of these classes, and that is a thing called the main method. And that's the other piece of the structure that you see here today. The importance of the main method is that the main method is essentially the starting point for your program, and everything that your program does starts from the main method and goes on from there. Most importantly, the main method serves as a container for code, and all of the code that we write for the first few weeks of the course is going to show up right there in the main method itself. All right, so in a minute, I'm going to put some actual Java code inside the main method. And so this gives us a starting point for our program and a place to start writing code and start putting code into the program. All right, and again, as you can see, these two parts, the hello class and the main method, those are set up for you automatically by NetBeans. So there's nothing more you have to do to get those things up and running. All you simply have to do is to go into the main method and start typing code. And that's how you'll be creating your programs, at least for the first few weeks of the term. Okay, now before I actually start putting any code into the main method here, let me make a brief remark on some other things that show up here. Some other things that you're going to see here is this text that appears in gray. This is an example of what's known as a comment. A comment is basically a block of text that you put somewhere in your program for the purpose of documenting or adding some extra information. And all of this information literally is optional. Java basically ignores anything that shows up in a comment. So if there's a comment that you have no use for, you can simply remove it from the program so that it no longer takes up space. And these things are, at least for the time being, are optional. So in fact, there's a number of these comments here that I don't particularly need, so I'm going to go ahead and strip them out. But let me show you quickly an example of a comment that might be more useful. An example of a comment that might be more useful is a comment that more directly addresses something that your program is going to do. All right, so I'm going to put a quick comment in here that documents something that goes on in our program. All right, so this is a more reasonable use for a comment. If you're about to do something in your program and you'd like to put a little bit of explanatory text that explains the purpose of what's about to happen, this is a much more reasonable and more legitimate reason for setting up a comment. It's basically used to document in words something that you're about to do in code. Right, so that's a more reasonable use for a comment. Another quick remark here is how the comment is structured. To make this type of comment, you basically start it with a combination of a slash and an asterisk. And then when you're done with the comment, you end it with a combination of an asterisk and a slash. This sets up what's called a multi-line comment. And as you can see, this is a comment that is allowed to cover many lines of text, and that's appropriate for that purpose. Another type of comment that you can use is what's called a single line comment. That starts with just a pair of forward slashes, and that's used for more simple comments, things that are short and only cover a single line of text. That's the way that you could document something using that. Okay, so now let's write our first actual piece of Java code. The first command I'm going to write is what's called a print command. This is a command which is basically used to print a message to the screen when the program runs. And for this, we're going to print our first basic hello message. And this is going to be the first basic thing that our program will be doing. Okay, so right away, we now have our first example of a piece of Java code. What I've just constructed is an example that's known as a statement. All programs that you write will basically consist of a list of statements. And the first thing you need to be aware of in Java statements is that Java uses a special bit of punctuation in combination with statements. And that punctuation is the semicolon that appears at the end of the statement. One of the first basic rules of the Java language is that programs are basically a set of individual statements, and each statement has to end with a semicolon. That's basically the main punctuation symbol that Java uses for what's called statements. All right, and since this is our first very basic example, consists of just a single statement, the only thing we have to watch out for is just to make sure that we put that semicolon at the end of that statement. All right, now the next step, after you have typed in whatever statements of Java code you need in your program, is to actually run it. And the mechanism for running your program is to go up here and click this green triangle. This is simply the run button. This will run your project. So I'll go ahead and click that. What that will do is that will compile the program. Down here, we're going to see some confirmation messages. In particular, we see a message saying that Java has just compiled our first bit of Java code. And then if that all goes successfully, the next thing that will happen is the program itself will run. And if the program produces any output, you'll see that output appearing down here in the so-called output pane. Okay, so we now have successfully set up our first Java program. We've got it to run, the program runs, and it produces the output that we expect in the output pane down at the bottom of the window. Okay, so that's the first brief example I wanted to show you today. Before we go on to the next example, let me pause here briefly and ask if anybody has any questions at this point. If you have a question for me, feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask me what question you have. Okay, so if there are no questions at this point, I'm going to put away this first example, and we're going to go on to our second example, which is a somewhat longer and more complex example. And in this example, we're going to see many of the more common features that you're going to see in Java programs. All right, so here is the code for our second example. First of all, to explain what this example does, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm simply going to run it so we can see what it does. If I, again, just click the run button, you'll see the program running. The first thing that's new in this example is that this example is a program that's going to feature both input and output. Most programs that do calculations, the first thing they're going to require from the user is some sort of input. So what we see here at the bottom is that the program has printed a prompt asking me to basically type in some data that the program will use as an input. This program is basically a simple calculator that converts Fahrenheit temperatures to Celsius. So the first thing it asks for is a Fahrenheit temperature. So let's enter a Fahrenheit temperature like 68 degrees. And then after entering our input value, I'll hit enter on the keyboard, and then the program will do whatever it's going to do with that input. All right, so here what the program actually does is it does a simple calculation to convert that Fahrenheit temperature into Celsius, and it prints a message showing us what the equivalent is in Celsius. 68 degrees Fahrenheit is equivalent to 20 degrees on the Celsius scale. All right, and again, if you want to run different examples, you simply rerun the project by clicking the run button each time. And if for each time you enter a value, it will then do the calculation and show you the corresponding result. All right, so that's the first new thing going on in this program, is that the program is designed to take input from the user and then do a calculation and then show you some output that gets printed to the output area. All right, so let's now go and take a look at the code itself and take a deeper look at some of the key parts of the program. All right, now the first thing that I want to comment on here is a feature that you're going to be seeing in every Java program, and that's what's known as variables. Any Java program that does any sort of calculation is going to need to work with data. And the first relevant thing to know about data in Java programs is that Java expects you to store all of your data in what are known as variables. Right? And to set up and start using variables in your program, the first step you have to do is what's known as a variable declaration. And let me start by making a little change to this program to show you a different way that you can declare a variable. All right, I'm going to make a quick change here. I'm going to take out parts of a couple of these statements. The first thing that happens when I did this is that NetBeans immediately starts to complain. Whenever NetBeans notices something in a program that's not quite right, it will underline the offending parts of the program, and it will give you an error message of some sort to let you know what it thinks the problem is. What just happened here is I messed up a couple of the variables. So now in the program, anytime you see Fahrenheit or Celsius, these have now been underlined. NetBeans is complaining and saying these things have not been set up properly. And whenever you see one of these underlines, what you can do is you can hover the mouse pointer over something that's underlined, and that will pop up a little message showing you what the source of the trouble is. In this case, we get an error message saying, I cannot find this symbol. It's basically saying that I think this thing is a variable, but you haven't done the right thing to set it up properly. All right, so let me go ahead and fix that for you. At the top of the main method here, I'm going to set up a couple of things. These are called variable declarations. All right, I'm going to set up one of these separately for each of the two variables that we're working with. All right, so here's the first variable declaration for the Fahrenheit variable, and here's the variable declaration for the Celsius variable. All right, and you'll notice that as soon as I put those two pieces into the code, and as soon as I get the spelling right here, that basically fixes that issue. Now NetBeans is no longer complaining about these two variables. These have now been set up appropriately. All right, so what I just did to fix the problem with the variables is that for each of the variables, I set up what's called a variable declaration. And a variable declaration consists of two parts. The second part in the variable declaration is simply the name of the variable. Each time you introduce a variable in a program, you have to give it an appropriate name, and that's part of what the variable declaration does. The other thing that the variable declaration does is it assigns what's called a type to each variable that you set up. We have to do this because Java is capable of dealing with many different types of data, and for each variable that you set up, you have to think briefly about what kind of data you plan to put in that variable, and then you have to assign an appropriate type to that variable that matches what you're planning to do with that variable. Right now, the type that I've chosen for both of these variables is I've chosen what's called the float type. This is the type that's used for numbers, and it's used specifically for numbers that have a decimal part to them. For example, in the run that I just did a minute ago, when I entered the temperature, I entered a temperature of 98.6. And since that number has a decimal part, the 0.6, that type of data has to be stored in a variable that's capable of dealing with decimal parts. So that's why we use the float data type here. That's appropriate when you're using numbers, and more specifically, it's appropriate when you're using numbers that have decimal parts to them. All right? And since both of the numbers we're going to be working with today may potentially have decimal parts, that's the appropriate data type that we use for that purpose. All right, so here's the first basic rule in Java programming, and that is all of the data in your program has to go into variables. And before you can actually use a variable in a Java program, you have to do what's called declaring it. And these two examples show how you go about successfully declaring variables that would be used in a program. All right, now, the next thing you need to worry about when you're working with a variable is you need to somehow assign a value to it. All right, a little bit further down in the program is an example of this sort of thing. All right, here's a statement in which I'm doing a calculation, and the end result of that calculation is going to be a piece of data, and that piece of data needs to be stored somewhere. So to make sure that that value that I've just computed gets put into a variable, I use what's called an assignment statement. All right, so here's an example of an assignment statement where we're basically computing a new value and we're then assigning that value to a variable. All right, so what this statement basically says is that on the right, I'm going to be doing a calculation. We're going to be doing some arithmetic. And then once that arithmetic produces a result, we're going to be storing that result into a variable by using this notation here. Basically, take that value and assign it to the Celsius variable. That's the main means whereby variables get their values. All right, and you'll also notice that in this program, since we have two different variables to work with, we have two of those assignment statements. Here's an assignment statement for the Celsius variable, and here is an assignment statement for the Fahrenheit variable. Okay, now the Fahrenheit variable is a little bit different because its value is actually going to come from something that the user types in. The way this program is expected to work is when the program runs, the program will put up a prompt, and then the user will type in a value, and whatever value they've typed in, that will eventually work its way into that Fahrenheit variable. All right, now, the statement that I've highlighted here is the statement that makes all of that work. And what's going to be happening here is we're going to be making use of a special mechanism called a scanner. And what the scanner does for you in Java is it basically reads input that the user types at the keyboard. And whenever you want to use the scanner to read a bit of input from the user, you use a construct that looks something like this. In this construct, what I've done is I'm talking to the scanner and I'm telling it, okay, the user is about to type a value. The value that they're about to type is a float value. I want you to go ahead and grab whatever number they've typed and take that value and store it for me into the variable that I've specified here. All right, so this is how we take a value that the user has typed in, and that's how that value makes its way into the variable, the Fahrenheit variable. All right, and then to use this mechanism, there's a couple of extra steps you need to do. Another step you'll need to do is that you'll have to actually put a statement in here that sets up the scanner itself. This is the little piece of Java code that's necessary for creating a scanner and getting it up and running. And the other thing that you'll need to do is when you're working with a scanner in a program, another special piece of the setup you'll need to do is you'll have to set up what's called an import statement. Okay, now again, this is all starting to throw quite a bit of technical information at you, but we're going to go over a lot of this stuff in more detail, especially in the lab exercise this week. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about setting up scanners and using them. We'll have some more detailed discussion of that a little bit later in the lab exercise that we do this week. But for now, the only thing to say is that what I'm doing here is I'm setting up the scanner. And then in this statement, I'm using the scanner to actually read a value that the user has typed in. And that's how we get a value stored into the Fahrenheit variable. Okay, so again, a lot of information thrown at you right there. Let's pause once again and have an opportunity for questions. So if you have a question at this point, go ahead and unmute and ask me your question. Okay, so if there are no questions at this point, let's go ahead and go on to the final part of the program, and that is after you have successfully done a calculation. In this case, we have done the calculation that converts the Fahrenheit to Celsius. The last thing that your program will need to do is it will need to actually produce some sort of an output that the user can see. And once again, this is going to involve the use of a print statement. All right, now this print statement is a little bit more elaborate than the example that we saw in the Hello World program. In this print statement, we're going to be printing a little bit more text. And the other thing going on here is we're going to be both mixing text with numerical values. All right, so let me break this down for you a little bit. I'm going to reformat this a little bit so we can see a little bit more clearly what's going on here. I'm going to break this down into separate parts, and we'll talk about what each individual part of this statement is actually doing. All right, so I'm going to spread it across several lines so we can see the structure of the whole thing. Okay, so the first thing going on here is that we're doing a print command. Anytime that you need to have something printed to the output pane, the first thing you'll start with is this command, which basically starts the process of printing some text. All right, now what goes inside the print command is the text that you want to actually print. Now, in some cases, that text would just consist of just a single message. Let me take this away briefly and show you how you would print just a simple message. To print a simple message, you would simply type some text and put that in quotes. That basically is a piece of text that you want printed. That's the simplest thing that you can do in a print statement. Right, now, a somewhat more complicated thing you can do is you can print a combination of both text and numbers. Right, so what we had here originally was that setup. In that setup, what we actually have here is a longer thing that's composed of several individual pieces of text. All right, so we have the word Fahrenheit, we have the word is, and we have the words in Celsius. Each of these basically show up as individual snippets of text inside quotes. But then, in addition to the text that shows up there, we also want to put some numbers. And those numbers are going to come from the variables that we have in our program. All right, so we have one variable that stores the Fahrenheit temperature. We have another variable that stores the Celsius temperature. And I basically want to insert those numbers into the output along with the text that's there. Right, now, to create that mix of both text and numbers, we use an operation that's called concatenation. And the way that you do concatenation in Java is through the use of the plus sign. If you need to create a longer piece of text that's basically made up of several smaller pieces of text that are glued together, the way that you do that is you assemble the individual pieces of text by using a system of concatenations or plus signs. So basically, in between each piece of this, there's a plus, and by gluing together all of the different parts of the statement, we have both the text and the numbers all glued together. And then when this finally gets printed, all of those things will show up together in the form of the output that you want, which now has a mixture of both the text and the numbers that you wanted to display in the output message. All right, so that's the basic procedure for printing a piece of text that has a combination of both text and numbers included in it. Okay, and one final comment to make about all of this is that, especially when you're doing something more complex, you have a couple of options about how to set this up. One option is you can basically put this entire thing in a single statement, and that single statement will span a little bit longer area in the code. Right, now, something you'll notice here is that on the right edge of the screen, there's this red line. This red line is sort of an artificial border that NetBeans puts in. And the reason it puts that in there is to show you that in some cases, you may be typing a statement that's a little bit long, and you may want to do something about that. Here's something that you can do if you're typing a statement that's a little bit long, is that in many cases, it's perfectly fine to break that statement across multiple separate lines of text. Right? So if you're typing a statement and the statement ends up being uncomfortably long, you always have the option of breaking it into multiple separate lines. That's perfectly fine and that's perfectly acceptable. And that's a good strategy for handling statements that start to get uncomfortably long and take up a lot of space. And to help you with that, NetBeans puts in this artificial barrier here at the red line. So anytime you find yourself typing a statement that goes beyond the red line, something you might want to think about doing is simply breaking it into separate lines so it doesn't take up quite as much space across the screen. That's a sort of a little prompt that NetBeans gives you for that. Okay, now one last thing to comment on in this example is this example is doing a calculation. So let's focus a little bit more closely on the part of the program where we're doing the actual calculation. All right, so when we arrive at this point in the program, what's happened is we have just read the input from the user. We have the Fahrenheit temperature that they entered. And what we want to do next is we want to do the conversion that converts that Fahrenheit temperature over to Celsius. Right now, to do that, we have to do a little bit of a calculation. And that calculation is taking place right here in this part of the assignment statement. Right now, what's going on in this particular calculation is we're doing a little bit of arithmetic. To convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius, you have to do some basic arithmetic. Basically, what you do is you start by taking the Fahrenheit temperature and you subtract 32 from that. And then you multiply that by 5/9, and that's the rule for converting Fahrenheit to Celsius. All right, so what I have here in the statement is all of the necessary arithmetic to do that conversion, both subtracting the 32 and multiplying by 5/9. That all takes place in this statement here. All right, now one quick comment to make here is some of the symbols that Java uses for doing arithmetic calculations. Right here, you'll see that Java uses the asterisk for multiplication. That's the symbol that you'll always be using anytime you do a multiplication in some arithmetic. And likewise, Java uses the / for division, right? And then, of course, for addition, Java uses a plus. And for subtraction, Java uses the minus. So the first thing you'll need to learn is the symbols used for arithmetic operations. You'll need to remember that asterisk is used for multiplication and the / is used for division. That's how we set up a simple arithmetic calculation and how we manage to do the translation here from Fahrenheit to Celsius. All right, and of course, the other thing to comment on this in this example is that if you need to use grouping for whatever reason in your arithmetic, for that, you just use the same parenthesis notation that you'd use in mathematics to group things in a larger calculation. Java uses exactly the same notation for that purpose. Okay, so there's our first complete running example. So once again, let me pause here briefly and ask if anybody has any questions at this point about what just happened in this first example. Okay, now, before we put this example away, let me make one or two final comments about what's going on here. Another comment that I'd like to make is that Java, especially for some basic things that you have to do in a program, allows you to do things in a variety of different ways. And let's go back and refocus on variables, and let me show you some variants of how you go about setting up variables. Because variables are such an important thing in Java programs. Java gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you set up variables and how you use them. So let me now show you some examples of some of the ways that you can set up variables in slightly different ways. The first example that I've shown you here is the most basic way to set up a variable in a Java program. And in this most basic method, you set up a variable by setting up a variable declaration for each variable. And when you use this method, this is typically the very first thing that you do at the beginning of the main method. Because variables are so fundamental to a program, one of the first and most basic rules that Java has is that all variables that you use in a program have to be declared. And since this is a very basic thing, one common way to handle that is to handle the variable declarations right away as literally the very first thing that you do. All right, so this is the first option you have when you're setting up variables, and that is right away, as soon as you start writing code, the very first thing you start writing is declarations for the variables that you plan to use. So this is one option for how to set up your variables. Right now, here's a variant that you can use. In this example, I used a separate declaration for each of the variables that I've set up. But in cases where you're setting up many variables, and especially if all those variables have the same type, here's a variant that you can use. If you have several variables and all those variables are going to end up having the same type, you can basically declare several variables at the same time. All right, so here's an example of that. In this program, we have two variables, Fahrenheit and Celsius. And since both of these variables have the same type, we can take care of declaring them in the same statement. All right, so the way that we do that is the statement starts with the type that we're planning to use. We're going to be using the float type because, again, we're using floating point numbers. And then once you've specified the type, you can then follow that up with a list of variables. So you can declare as many variables as you want in one place. So if you need to declare, say, 4 variables, all of which have the same type, you can do them all in a single statement like that, and that is a somewhat shorter and more compact way to take care of doing the variable declarations. All right, and then there's another way to do variable declarations, and that is instead of doing the variable declarations right here at the very start, another option you have for setting up variables is you can basically declare each variable right away at the first time you use it. All right, so if you take away the variable declaration, once again, NetBeans will complain at you. But if you want to then fix that, one way to fix that is to both declare the variable and start using it right away in the same statement. All right, so here's another variant that you can use, and that is right away when you first start to use a variable, you can actually do the variable declaration in that statement before you start to do anything at all with the variable. All right, so this is another variant which is legal, and in this variant, basically what you do is you combine both the declaration, which shows up here, and the assignment, and do both of these in the same statement. So here you end up with a statement that sets up the variable and then also gives it a value all in one step. And that's a more convenient way to do all of this basically in one statement. So that's an alternative that you can use for setting up variables. Okay, so at this point, I see I've actually run a little bit over. That's the last of the things that I wanted to show you. So one last comment about what we're doing here today is, again, I'll point you toward the lecture notes and show you that everything that I've just covered today is covered in the lecture notes. You'll see that all documented pretty thoroughly in the lecture notes that I've posted. And one other thing to take note of is at the top of the lecture notes, you're also going to see some suggested reading in the textbook. So along with the lectures, the other thing that you want to do is you want to start reading portions of the textbook. So at the top of the lecture notes for today's lecture, I have some suggested sections in the textbook that you should be reading. So what you should start doing is crack open the textbook and start reading the sections that I've listed here. Your goal should be to try to read those sections ideally by Friday of this week. And you want to be doing that reading at the same time that you've been going through the lecture material, because the readings will go into much greater depth and much greater detail on what we've just covered in the lecture. And you'll want to be doing that reading as you go along in the textbook as we work our way through the lectures. Okay, so that's all that I have for you today. I'll be seeing half of you tomorrow in the lab sessions, and I'll be seeing the other half of you on Thursday. Look forward to seeing you all again later in the week, and that's all for now. All right, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for you, if it's not too late, Professor.